Here we go. All right. So we were talking about cell biology, and I took a bit of a segue to get to ecology, which is the last major topic we're going to cover in this course. And this maybe gets away from the more abstract things we've been talking about in genetics and molecular biology, because what I'm going to be talking about are things that you can see outside your own window. Ecology is the way that different organisms interact with each other and also interact with the environment that they're in, with the light and water and soil and temperature and salt content if they're in the ocean. All of the things that they deal with are covered in ecology. There, I just remembered. Let's do, there we go. Let's do the transcription. And even though it's often useful to talk about living things as if they are isolated entities, the truth is that there's no such thing as a truly single organism, because living things interact with each other all the time, constantly. And ecology is the study of how they do it. And for our purposes, we'll talk about ecology at different levels of organization. If you talk about all members of one species in one definite area, we would call that a population. So you could talk about the population of clover plants on your lawn, the population of dandelions in that grassy strip outside the baseball stadium, the population of crappie in Lake Conway. All of those would be populations. And of course, we could talk about the human population of Faulkner County, Arkansas, or something like that if we wanted to. Admit. Okay. When we take a set of populations in one area, please mute your mic, whoever that is. We can now start talking about communities. So we could talk about the fish community of Lake Conway, which would be not just the crappie, but it would be the sunfish and the gizzard shad and the minnows. We could talk about the plant community of UCA's Nature Reserve, which I think you get to see next week, which would include everything from the sweet gums and the oaks to the catbrier, the honeysuckle, the beautyberry, and the pepper vine. All of those and many more would make up the community of, let's say, the nature reserve. So that's many populations that all interact with each other. When we're talking about all the communities and all their non-living surroundings in one area, we have an ecosystem. So if I was talking about the ecosystem of the Jewel Moore Nature Reserve, I would be talking about everything from the chanterelle mushrooms to the passion fruit and pepper vine, to the feral cats, to the dragonflies and other insects, all of those living communities. And I'd also be throwing in all of the things that are important, even though they're not actually alive. And you'll see this word again, the word for something in this context that isn't alive is abiotic. And so if I'm talking about abiotic things in an ecosystem, I might be talking about the amount of sun that they get. I might be talking about the temperature that they live in, or the degree that the temperature fluctuates. I might be talking about the amount of oxygen that's present. I might be talking about the amount of salt in the water if we're talking about an ecosystem in the oceans. I might be talking about nutrients in the soil. All of those things are not technically alive, and yet all of them are important in the ecosystem. All of those play a very important role. When we look at a bunch of similar ecosystems, we could start calling that a biome. An example of this would be, well, when you go to the Jewel Moore Nature Reserve next week, part of what makes that reserve important is it preserves a small fragment of a type of grassland called prairie. One of the last little pieces of prairie that before European settlement covered all of what is now Conway. And similar prairies used to cover large chunks of Arkansas and, in fact, huge chunks of the American West. All of that was prairie of one sort or another. And almost all of that, unfortunately, has been destroyed. So we could group all these prairies together and talk about the prairie biome, all the set of similar ecosystems globally. We could talk about, there are tropical rainforests in, for example, South America, in equatorial Africa, in Northern Australia and New Guinea and Southeast Asia, even in places like Hawaii. All of those are different ecosystems, but they still have things in common. So we could talk about the tropical rainforest biome, or the prairie biome, or the what I'm looking at outside my door, the mixed conifer hardwood forest biome. Yeah, I live on a piece of land that's got lots of trees on it, kind of nice, except when they drop leaves on and branches on the roof. And then if we're talking about the sum of all life on Earth, we call that the biosphere. And we're basically going to be moving in the next couple of weeks from small to large and looking at all of these levels of structure in turn. So let's start by talking about populations. Imagine we've got a population of living things. Well, living things reproduce. Living things breed and make more like them. If you start with just a few bunny rabbits in your yard, the bunny rabbits will breed like rabbits, because that's what they are. And they'll make more rabbits. And then those rabbits will breed and make even more. And those will make even more. And the population size goes up, keeps on shooting up. And if we had a population that had unlimited resources, all of the food that it needed, all of the nutrients or whatever that it needed, all of the right temperature and amount of water and all of that, if there were nothing controlling it, the population would grow exponentially. A simple way to think about what exponential growth is that the population will double in a certain time period. So our population of 100 bunny rabbits might be 200 in 1 year, and 400 in another year, and 800 in another year, and 1,600 in another year, constantly doubling over some fixed interval. That's exponential growth. And if we draw a graph of it, it looks like this. This is an exponential curve. Sometimes you'll see it called a J curve because it looks a little like a capital letter J. Duh. And you can see it starts out growing relatively slowly, but the rate of growth keeps increasing with time. And it never quite gets vertical, but it gets closer and closer to vertical as the rate of population growth takes off. So that's what exponential growth looks like. Am I missing a slide? I seem to be missing a slide. Sorry, I thought I had one. Little bit of a math moment. I'm not going to make you memorize this equation. You are never going to have to solve it on the exam. I just want to show you what this looks like. That exponential curve that I show you is defined by this equation called the logistic equation. N sub t right there, that is what the population is at time t. So what is the population going to be, 2 years from when we start looking at it, or 5 years, or 6 months, or whatever it is? That time is t. So the population at that time is equal to the starting population, n subscript 0, multiplied by a number e, and lowercase e is an irrational number that's approximately equal to 2.718. It's one of those irrational numbers because the digits never repeat and never stop. But e is a constant. Okay, and e is raised to the power r times t. T is, again, time, the length of time it's been going on. And r is a number called the intrinsic rate of increase that expresses how steeply that population is shooting up. If e is 1, then the population is going to grow, but its slope is going to be relatively low. If e is 4 or 5 or something like that, the population is going to go up like a rocket. If r is equal to 0, by the way, then the population doesn't grow at all. It just stays steady. Because if r is equal to 0, then e to the power 0 times t is just equal to 1, because anything to the 0 power is 1. And the population at any time is just going to be equal to the starting population. So r expresses how steeply the population is shooting up. And when we plug this in with some actual data, we get some rather surprising conclusions. This is a couple of fruit flies caught in the act of making more fruit flies that are mating. Under perfect conditions where the flies have just the right temperature, plenty of water, lots of nutritious overripe bananas to feed on, everything that they need, the life cycle actually takes about 7 days. 7 days from a female laying eggs to those females hatching, maturing, going through a maggot stage, and then emerging, and then mating with each other and laying eggs. You might remember that this was what has made fruit flies so useful for genetics research, in that you can grow lots of them quickly and do a lot of experiments in a short period of time. This is one of the reasons why Thomas Hunt Morgan did genetics experiments on fruit flies and not on elephants. The elephant life cycle is 10 years. Fruit flies, it's 7 days. And if you plug some numbers into that equation, you find that if you started with one pair of flies that had perfect conditions, just the right temperature, just the right moisture, all of the nourishing food they needed, and you let that one pair of flies breed, and then you let their offspring breed, and we'll leave out the fact that they'd be breeding with each other, and you'd end up with pretty inbred flies, leave that out, and you just kept on going, and every generation had perfect conditions. In 1 year, you'd have a ball of flies the size of planet Earth. Now, clearly, this does not happen. Earth has been around for longer than 1 year. I should know, I was there. And it has not been replaced with a giant ball of fruit flies, 8,000 miles, 8,000 miles in diameter. So something has to act, something, to keep those populations down. Fruit fly populations can grow, especially if it's in your kitchen and you left some bananas out on the counter and forgot about them. They can grow quite fast, but we never see that unlimited exponential growth. Something has to act to keep that population under control. And it could be predators, it could be spiders that are catching and eating the fruit flies or something like that. It could be starvation. If fruit flies run out of food, some of them will start dying. It could be disease. It could be parasites. It could be irate homeowners with cans of Raid spray insecticide. It could be lots of things, but something must always act to keep that population down. And when we look at an ecosystem, we can talk about how each population has what we call a carrying capacity. That's the maximum number of individuals that can be stably supported in an ecosystem. And that's determined by both biotic and abiotic factors. And again, biotic is anything that's living, and abiotic is anything that is not living. So biotic factors that control the number of fruit flies would be the presence of predators like larger insects or spiders or something like that. The presence of parasites. In one of my other classes, we've actually found parasites inside fruit flies. They can die of parasite infection. The presence of food sources, which in the case of fruit flies is generally overripe fruits and veg. That's a living thing that's important for determining how many fruit flies can live in a particular area. And then abiotic factors might include the temperature. They might include the availability of moisture. They might include the availability of oxygen. For other species, they might include the amount of sunlight, if we were talking about plants instead of fruit flies. All of these things are not themselves living, but they're important for living things. And collectively, they determine the maximum number of individuals that a population can, in a population that can be supported stably. So a simple model of how populations grow looks like this. Populations might grow for a while. They'll grow almost exponentially for a time, but then they will start leveling off and eventually level off at the carrying capacity. This type of growth curve, by the way, is called a sigmoid curve. Sigma means it's shaped like the Greek letter sigma, or in this case, it's shaped like the letter S. And you can see that that curve is, okay, it's not a very curvy letter S, but, you know, it kind of looks like the letter S in, you know, Star Wars, right? The Star Wars logo has this S that looks kind of like that. So that's why that's called a sigmoid curve. I should mention that living things don't decide, hey, we're getting close to the carrying capacity, we better start controlling our rate of birth. Fruit flies are not capable of doing something like that. Fruit flies will just mate and lay eggs. It's what they do. What happens as a population starts reaching carrying capacity is that the rate of birth starts being balanced by the rate of death. So when a population is on this stable plateau up here, they're still breeding, they're still reproducing, but the number of individuals that die balances out the number of new individuals that are being born. So a population is still reproducing, and we can't really say it's trying, because something like a fruit fly can't try to do things. It doesn't really have the brain power to do that. You know, the population may still be reproducing, but once we're at the carrying capacity, the death rate from predators and parasites and angry homeowners with cans of Raid and everything else, that death rate balances the birth rate, and the net growth of the population is 0. You can have other cases that a population might increase and overshoot the carrying capacity temporarily and then fall back. You might find that a population might grow, overshoot the carrying capacity, and then undershoot and overshoot and undershoot and overshoot and kind of oscillate, you know, zigzag back and forth. In some cases, a population might even way overshoot and then crash. So you can get more complicated things going on than just that simple logistic growth that levels off. It all depends on what that intrinsic rate of growth is. I should mention here that carrying capacity here is spelled with a K, not because the makers of this graphic could not spell, but it's because just as we abbreviate that intrinsic rate of increase as lowercase r, when we write mathematical equations that describe population growth and we want to plug in carrying capacity, we represent carrying capacity with a capital K. So there's your capital K right there. Okay. So if you have conditions that enable a species to vastly overshoot K, you can get a so-called population explosion. You're looking at a scene from a swarm of locusts in 2013. Locusts are related to grasshoppers. They are plant-eating insects. And for reasons that I do not really understand, I'm not an insect specialist, the population of locusts may stay relatively low, but every so often you'll get these huge booms and the population will grow incredibly fast and produce huge numbers of locusts that swarm over an area and basically eat all of the vegetation there, and then finally die out in great numbers when there is no more vegetation to eat and the land has pretty much been stripped. So that's one of the things that can happen that's a little bit more complicated than just a population rising to the carrying capacity and then leveling off. Sometimes you get really big overshoots, but they're not permanent. An overshoot is eventually going to come to an end and the population will decline. Incidentally, the same basic math, a reason why some of you might care about this more than maybe you do right now, is that math models the course of not just populations of locusts or fruit flies or things like that, but the population of disease cases. That's some data from 2014 to 2016. There was an outbreak of a deadly virus called Ebola. And if you look at the cumulative number of cases, you can see there was an early stage where the virus infected lots of people got sick. And then as people died from the virus and other people started taking precautions to try to keep from getting it, the number of cumulative infections leveled off because the virus was finding, quote, fewer and fewer people that it could infect. And we get a curve that looks a lot like exponential growth. Okay, and we've got a student who's doing research on epidemic models. Okay, this is going to sound pretty familiar. When we talked about flattening the curve, we meant reducing that rate of growth. This seems so nostalgic right now. This was the cumulative number of infections in early 2020. I think, I'm not sure if this is the US or global. I'd have to look it up, but you can see that we start, picking it up in mid-March, and by the middle of April, dang. And if you remember all of the things that we were doing, all of the masking, all of the isolation, the social distancing, the staying in your house and watching entirely too much Netflix and feeling like you're going nuts, all of that was meant to flatten the curve. And you might remember that phrase was used a lot, flattening the curve. And that means reducing the rate at which that exponential curve is shooting upwards. I should mention that the math that's used to model epidemics is a little bit different, and the number that they use is called capital R0. It is related to the lowercase r that we use in population ecology. So yeah, the math used for modeling epidemics and the math used for modeling population growth is related, although there are technical differences. And Anna, you probably know more about them than I do. I'm not an epidemiologist, except everybody kind of is after 2 years of the pandemic. Right. So a similar, although not quite the same concept is used in tracking disease. But remember that in a community is a set of populations. And one of the things we find is that populations influence each other. And this is some beautiful data that shows you how it happens. In northern Canada, the Hudson Bay Company buys animal furs from trappers, right? There's not much land that you could farm up in northern Canada. It's too cold, it's too snowy. But there are fur-bearing critters, and you might remember the fur trade has been important in North American history ever since the 1600s. And the Hudson Bay Company keeps records of the furs that it buys. Now, trappers don't successfully kill every one of the fur-bearing animals up there. They probably don't even kill that many relative to the total population size. So in years where a fur-bearing animal population is large, the trappers manage to trap a lot of furs from that species. And when the population's small, trappers manage to catch only a few animals of that species. So we can use the number of furs that trappers bring into the Hudson Bay Company as an estimate of overall population size. And those records go back over 150 years. And the two species we're going to look at are on the left. That is the Canadian lynx, a beautiful little kitty cat closely related to bobcats, which live farther south. I don't know if you've ever seen bobcats, although I did see one once walk right across a road in front of our car in rural Perry County once. So we do have them around here. And Canadian lynx just absolutely love to eat them some snowshoe hare, which is the little bunny wabbit that you see over there on the right. And you might remember from lab, this is one of the little bunny wabbits that is white in the winter when there's snow and turns brown in summer when there's no snow. So it's it always blends in. That's a species you've seen before. So we look at lynx and we look at hares, and lynx's favorite food happens to be snowshoe hares. And it turns out that if you start back in 1850 and you look at how those populations grow, the populations of snowshoe hares and of the lynxes neither one rises and levels off the way we might expect. What they follow is pretty regular cycles of boom and bust, each cycle taking about 10 years roughly. And if you look carefully, you might notice that the lynx population peaks just a little bit after the hare populations peak. So if I graph right here where the hare populations are reaching their peak, right? We've got a peak right there, and 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 we got a peak right there. If you look very carefully at where the lynxes are peaking, right, we've got a peak right there, and we got a peak right there. And I'm not drawing very straight lines, I'm aware of this, and a peak right there, and a peak right there. The lynx peaks are always coming just a little bit after the hare peaks. You can probably see it most easily over here, but all through this graph, the lynxes are peaking just a little bit after the hares. And these booms and busts are coming in a surprisingly regular cycle with a period of about 10 years. And the reason is that here is a lynx that is about to kill the wabbit. They've got these really big paws for running on snow and also for snagging delicious hares. And so think about it. If we have a small population of hares, those hares will breed. They breed, like rabbits. They'll make more of themselves. And the hare population will increase in numbers. And for a while, it might increase exponentially. But that means there's more food for the lynxes. So the lynxes eat lots of hares. When there's lots of food for the lynxes can raise more kittens. Mommy is healthier. She can have more babies and make more milk. And the lynx population becomes more and more abundant because there's more food for them. However, when there's lots of lynxes, they eat many more hares, like this lynx is about to do. And if the lynxes are very abundant, the hare population starts falling because so many hares get eaten by lynxes. Okay, but now that the hare population has fallen, the lynx population has less food. There's less food. Mommy lynx is not as well nourished. She can't find enough food for all of her babies. She may not be able to make enough milk. If the babies grow up, they may not have enough to live on. They may die of starvation. And the lynxes become less abundant because there's less food for them. But now that the lynx's population is low, now the hares can start increasing in number again because they've got fewer predators. So you have these regular cycles of booms and busts in both the hares and the lynxes, with the lynxes peaking a little bit after the hares do. Right? So if we graph these, we start with the hare population going up, right? Like that. But when the hare population is high, there's lots of food for the lynxes, so the lynx population goes up. But once the lynx population is high, the hare population starts dropping because there's so many predators that the hares can't survive. But once the bunny population is low, the lynxes start running out of food and they begin dying off. And so the lynxes become rare. But once the lynxes have become rare, the bunny population no longer has so many predators, so more rabbits survive and their population grows, and so on. And we get this natural cycle with the lynxes lagging the hares just a little bit. And that's how you can have two populations influencing each other in a community. There can be other ways in which they do it that can be more subtle. Here's some plants in a forest. Now, the plants in a forest are not directly fighting each other. I mean, unless they're ents or something like that, you know, unless they're Treebeard and, you know, punching each other out. Sorry, Lord of the Rings reference. But they do only have a fixed amount of sunlight. There's only so much solar energy that lands on every square meter of forest. And even though the trees are not punching each other and they're not eating each other, they're still competing for access to a finite amount of sunlight. And the taller trees can block sunlight from reaching shorter plants. And the shorter plants may either end up dying out or they have to adapt through natural selection to survive on less light. Or they might adapt growing very slender and tall so they can climb up the trees and grab sunlight of their own. That would be vines. But this would be a form of competition. This right here is a view of a place in the Mojave Desert in Death Valley National Park called the Devil's Cornfield. And this is some of the harshest desert in the world. The highest recorded temperature is, I want to say, 146 Fahrenheit. If memory serves, that's about 57 Celsius. I wasn't there on that day, but I've been out there when the temperature on the floor of the valley has been over 120 Fahrenheit. At that heat, it doesn't matter whether there's humidity or not. You still freaking suffer. You will die very quickly if you don't have lots of water. The creosote bush can survive because this bush is only maybe 3-4 feet tall, okay, maybe a meter or a bit more, but the roots are extremely deep and they not only penetrate very deeply, but they spread out a very long way. And they're so good at getting water that they outcompete any other plant. Any seed that falls close to a creosote bush is not going to get enough water to survive because the creosote bush is so darn good at slurping every last droplet of water out of that dry soil. And that's why this picture looks so evenly planted. This creosote bush right here in the middle, there's a zone all around it that represents where its roots extend. And anywhere in that zone, not much else is going to be able to grow. And there's another zone around these creosote bushes over here, and off here in the distance, that would be another zone. And over here, this one would have a zone of its own, and this one would have its own zone. And that's what competition for water looks like in a desert plant. And that can have the effect of having these plants that are spaced so evenly, at first glance, it looks like somebody deliberately planted them that way. So that's ways that populations can compete. The very last thing I want to talk about is we've been talking about carrying capacity. And on those graphs that I showed you, it looks just like a flat line. However, that's not quite the case because an organism can modify the carrying capacity of its own environment by its own activities. A plant growing in soil, if it's like a tree that drops its leaves in the fall, those leaves will fall on the soil and they'll rot there. And they'll put some nutrients back into the soil and they'll change the quality of the soil. So plants growing in a stony area will slowly build up soil and increase the carrying capacity for more plants. Kind of a neat thing that they do. Humans are extremely good at modifying the carrying capacity. New farming methods have boosted the world's food supply over the past few hundred years. It was thought that the global population might end up topping out at about 2 billion, and it hasn't done that. And that's because humanity's gotten really good at increasing our own carrying capacity. However, in some areas, we're decreasing our species carrying capacity. For example, the dry grassland south of the Sahara Desert, shaded here in orange, is called the Sahel. And it can support people. There are certainly people that live in Sudan and Chad and Niger and Mali and Mauritania. The problem is that there's overgrazing there, overgrazing by livestock. There are poor irrigation techniques. And as a result of that, last I checked, nearly 4,000 square miles, roughly 6 typical Arkansas counties, turns into desert every year, turns from being dry grassland into a desert. And that means the carrying capacity for human populations in the Sahel is dropping. Unfortunately, the human population itself is rapidly rising, and this is eventually going to be a real problem when there are more people in the Sahel than the land can support. And it's because humans, doing the best they can, are having the effect of decreasing the carrying capacity for human populations in the Sahel. And it could happen elsewhere. We've lost something like 10% of the fertile topsoil in the world since 1945 because of poor agricultural practices. So our own carrying capacity certainly has the potential to drop. But I'm not going to be gloom and doom here, but just a reminder that the carrying capacity is not handed down by God. The carrying capacity can be modified up or down by the actions of organisms in an ecosystem. And I'm a couple of minutes long, so I will go ahead and stop there.